There is a sequence, not a theory, not a forecast. A sequence, a mathematical rhythm that has echoed through a century of financial history with unnerving precision. And right now, in this moment, we are standing at the threshold of its final turn. 1929, the Great Depression. 90 years later, 2019, the calm before the COVID collapse. But that's not the sequence you think it is. Look deeper. Look at the machinery beneath the dates. 1933, the United States abandons the domestic gold standard. 40 years later, 1971, Nixon shuts the gold window for good. 37 years after that, 2008, the global financial architecture nearly comes apart. And now, 18 years later, we move toward 2026, the moment when $8.9 trillion in U.S. Treasury debt matures and must be refinanced at interest rates 3 times higher than when it was issued. Do you see the structure now? This isn't a market cycle. It isn't bulls and bears or recession and recovery. This is the mathematical failure state of a system built on debt, expansion, and dilution reaching its terminal point. Global debt has now surpassed $315 trillion, 333% of global GDP. The United States alone carries $36 trillion in federal debt, with interest costs that already exceed the entire defense budget. Inflation, which central banks insisted they could control, has eaten away purchasing power across every developed economy. The system isn't malfunctioning. It is operating exactly as designed until the design breaks. And here's what you must understand. What approaches in 2026 is not a crash, not a correction. It is the inevitable result of a 4-stage pattern that has repeated 3 times in modern history, a pattern so precise, so mechanical, that once you recognize it, you cannot unsee it. This is the 90-year supercycle, and we are moving through its final phase. Every major monetary collapse of the last century follows the same 4-step mechanism, not similar, identical. Whether Weimar Germany, the British Empire, or the United States, the machinery does not change. A nation or empire begins with a currency backed by something tangible, gold, a hard asset. Trust forms. Trust becomes credit. Credit fuels growth. The structure appears stable because it is anchored to reality. Governments can borrow, but only within natural limits. The hard asset restrains infinite expansion. Then comes the temptation. War, crisis, political pressure, or simple greed demands more money than the system can honestly support. The link is severed. Gradually or suddenly, the currency is weakened. The anchor is removed. Leaders convince themselves and the public that backing is unnecessary, that institutional trust alone will hold. And for a time, it works. Credit surges. Asset prices rise. People feel wealthier. This is the golden age of illusion. But the expansion becomes unstable. Debt grows faster than output. Inflation appears, first quietly, then everywhere. Authorities try to regain control, raising rates, enforcing austerity, manipulating markets. But the mathematics cannot be reversed. The debt cannot be repaid in money that keeps its value. So the money must lose value to service the debt. Confidence weakens. Markets swing violently. The system staggers between inflation and deflation, never stabilizing. The collapse is not always sudden. Sometimes the breakdown is slow, a steady erosion rather than a single shock. But the ending never changes. The currency stops functioning. Savings disappear. The social contract fractures. What follows is hyperinflation, a debt default, or a forced monetary reset. The people who recognize the pattern early protect themselves. Everyone else is fed into the machine. This isn't speculation. This is documented history, and I'm going to show it to you 3 times. We begin with the collapse of the world's greatest empire. In 1914, the British pound was the global reserve currency. It was tied to gold at a fixed rate under the classical gold standard. Britain ruled a quarter of the world's population and dominated global trade. The pound wasn't just trusted, it defined stability itself. Then, World War I erupted. Britain needed to fund the most expensive conflict in human history. The gold standard became a constraint. In 1914, the government suspended gold convertibility to print money for the war. Debt exploded from £650 million to more than £7.4 billion by 1919. Inflation followed. Prices doubled. After the war, Britain attempted to return to gold in 1925 under Winston Churchill, but they made a fatal mistake. They restored the pound at its pre-war parity, overvaluing it by roughly 10%. British exports became uncompetitive. The economy buckled. National pride took precedence over economic reality. The overvalued pound became a trap. Britain bled gold reserves trying to defend the illusion. Meanwhile, the United States was accumulating gold. France was hoarding it, and global trade was unraveling. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the pressure became impossible to withstand. By 1931, Britain was losing gold at a rate of 2.5 million pounds per day. On September 21, 1931, they abandoned the gold standard entirely. The pound, the currency that had anchored global finance for a century, was set adrift. Within days, 24 other nations followed. Sterling fell by nearly 30%. Britain's financial leadership shifted to the United States. The empire entered its terminal decline. An entire generation of British savers watched their purchasing power evaporate. The mechanism had run its course. Now we turn to the system that replaced it. In 1944, as World War II drew to a close, the Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. There they built a new monetary order with the US dollar at its core. Every major currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be backed by gold at $35 an ounce. Why did the world accept this arrangement? Because the United States controlled more than 20,000 tons of gold, over 60% of the planet's official reserves. The dollar wasn't just backed by gold, it was gold in paper form. The dollar wasn't just backed by gold, it functioned as gold in paper form. Confidence was absolute. Then came the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, and Lyndon Johnson's refusal to raise taxes to fund both. The U.S. government began printing dollars far beyond its gold reserves. Other nations saw it happening. France, under Charles de Gaulle, started converting dollars into gold on a massive scale. By 1971, the United States had only 8,100 tons of gold remaining, while foreign claims on that gold exceeded $80 billion, far more than could be honored at $35 per ounce. The system was mathematically insolvent. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced a temporary suspension of dollar-to-gold convertibility. It was never temporary. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed only by the government's promise. The world had no choice but to accept it. Global trade and global debt were already denominated in dollars. What followed was this chaos of the 1970s. Stagflation, oil shocks, double-digit inflation, interest rates soaring above 15%. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, was forced to crush the economy with brutal rate hikes to restore some degree of stability. The dollar survived only because the United States had the geopolitical leverage to impose a new system, the petrodollar. Oil would be priced in dollars. Nations would need dollars to buy energy. This created artificial, enforced demand for the currency, but the debasement never stopped. Since 1971, the dollar has lost more than 87% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 then costs more than $7 now. Gold, freed from government control, rose from $35 an ounce to more than $2,600. The pattern repeated. The anchor was cut. Expansion continued, and the crisis was merely postponed. Now we enter the modern era. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the world embraced a new faith: central bank omnipotence. Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke convinced markets that the Federal Reserve could control economic cycles at will. Debt wasn't dangerous. It was a policy instrument. Housing prices couldn't fall. Risk had been engineered away. The financial system built a towering pyramid of leverage on this belief. Banks, hedge funds, and institutions borrowed 30, 40, even 50 times their capital. Mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps so complex that even their architects couldn't fully explain them. From 2001 to 2007, the Federal Reserve held interest rates artificially low to prevent a deeper recession after the dot-com collapse. Cheap money flooded into housing. Prices doubled. Subprime mortgages, loans issued to borrowers who had no ability to repay, were packaged, sliced, stamped AA, and sold to pension funds and sovereign wealth funds worldwide. Global debt surged. By 2007, U.S. household debt alone had climbed to 100% of GDP. Financial sector debt was even higher. Everyone borrowed under the assumption that asset prices would rise forever. Then, in 2007, housing peaked and began to fall. Subprime borrowers started defaulting. The securities built on those mortgages collapsed in value. In March 2008, Bear Stearns failed. In September, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, the largest in American history. The entire global financial system froze. Banks stopped lending. Credit markets seized. Stocks lost half their value. Unemployment spiked. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and central banks across the world cut rates to zero and began creating money at unprecedented scale. This was quantitative easing, the polite label for manufacturing trillions of dollars from nothing. The system didn't collapse. It was rescued. But how? By repeating the very behavior that caused the crisis. More debt, more money creation, more intervention. Since 2008, global debt has grown by more than $100 trillion. Central banks have added over $25 trillion through QE alone. Interest rates stayed near zero for over a decade. Asset prices hit records, not because of growth, but because of liquidity. They didn't fix the problem. They magnified it. And now the bill is coming due. Let's apply the pattern to the present. The global financial system rests on U.S. Treasury bonds. They are treated as risk-free. Pension funds, banks, foreign governments, and central banks hold trillions in treasuries. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency. Trust is institutional, enforced by U.S. scale and power. Since 2008, the U.S. has added more than $20 trillion in federal debt. What was $10 trillion is now $36 trillion. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion to nearly $9 trillion at its peak. The pandemic accelerated everything. $5 trillion in stimulus in under 2 years. The money supply, measured by M2, rose 40% in 2020 alone. Inflation returned, not temporary, but systemic. Prices for food, energy, housing, and essentials have risen 20 to 30% since 2020. Wages haven't kept up. Savings have been wiped out. And now interest rates have climbed from near zero to above 5%. The cost of servicing the debt has exploded. The United States paid more than $1 trillion in interest last year, more than its entire defense budget. Here is the critical point. Between now and 2026, $8.9 trillion in Treasury debt will mature. All of it was issued when rates were near zero. It must now be refinanced at rates 3 times higher. This isn't political commentary. It's arithmetic. The debt cannot be serviced at these levels without either massive cuts to government spending, massive tax hikes, or massive money creation. None of those choices are politically survivable. So what will they do? They will print. And they have already begun. The bond market is starting to fracture. In 2023, U.S. Treasuries recorded one of their worst years in history. Foreign holders, especially China and Japan, are steadily reducing their positions. The Federal Reserve is trapped. If they cut rates, inflation returns with force. If they keep rates high, the debt spiral accelerates and markets break. At the same time, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are openly exploring alternatives to the dollar for trade. Saudi Arabia now accepts yuan for oil. The petrodollar system that upheld U.S. dominance for half a century is beginning to weaken. The signs of slippage are everywhere. Regional banks failing in 2023. European pension funds under stress. Yield curve inversions, flashing recession. Corporate defaults at record highs. Federal Reserve policy swinging back and forth with no stability. We are in the destabilized phase. The moment just before the pattern finishes. This is what's coming, not a guess. The logical endpoint of the mechanism. The U.S. government will face a choice: default on the debt or destroy the currency. A default would collapse the global system and erase American power overnight. So they will choose the alternative. They will print money to pay the debt. Inflation will return, but not at 4 or 6%. It will be structural, persistent, accelerating. The Federal Reserve will resume quantitative easing under a new label. They may call it liquidity support or yield curve control. The name does not matter. The outcome is identical. The dollar will lose purchasing power, not in a sudden collapse, but in a steady, crushing decline. Like water slowly brought to a boil. Cash holders will be devastated. Assets tied to the dollar, especially long-term bonds, will be destroyed. Retirees, pension funds, and savers will watch their wealth disappear. And the cruelest part is this: most people will not understand what is happening until it has already happened. They will blame politicians, corporations, or foreign rivals. But the cause will be the same mechanism that broke the British pound, that ended Bretton Woods, that detonated the 2008 crisis. The pattern will have completed. So what can you do? First, understand this. The pattern is not optional. It is not a scenario. It is the mathematical endpoint of a debt-based fiat system that has exhausted its expansion phase. You will hear familiar assurances that this time is different, that American exceptionalism will shield the system, that the dollar is too large, too central, too entrenched to fail, that technology or productivity will outrun the debt, that central banks have learned from past mistakes. The same promises were made in 1931. They were made in 1971. They were made in 2008. They were never true. The machine runs on the same rules every time. Currency dilution erodes confidence. Eroded confidence triggers crisis. Crisis ends in collapse or reset. The only thing that changes is the speed, and right now, the speed is increasing. 2026 is not an arbitrary year. It is the point where the largest refinancing wave in Treasury history collides with structural inflation geopolitical fracture, and a weakening dollar system. It is the moment when the math stops being avoidable. Here is what matters. You must position yourself outside the system. The pattern punishes anyone holding assets tied to the failing currency. It protects those who hold real assets, things that cannot be printed, diluted, or inflated away. Understand the mechanism. Once you can see the four-stage cycle, you can pinpoint where we are at any moment. That clarity is more valuable than prediction because it isn't about guessing the future. It's about recognizing the present. Do not be caught off guard. Most people will be. They always are. They trust institutions, experts, and reassurances. And every time those institutions prioritize their own survival over the public's wealth. The 90-year supercycle is not a hypothesis. It is history repeating because incentives never change. Governments always choose short-term safety over long-term stability. They always weaken the currency rather than confront the consequences of their debt, and the public always pays. The final reckoning is coming. The only question is whether you will see it approaching or be swept away by it. If you want to understand how this machine was built, who engineered it, when, and for what purpose, I've broken it down step by step in the next video. And if you want to know how to protect yourself, how to position your wealth, and which assets survive this kind of collapse, that is covered in the video after that. This is not entertainment. This is not speculation. This is the pattern, and the pattern is absolute. Subscribe, watch the next video, and prepare yourself. 2026 is closer than you think.